In the luxurious corridors of the Imperial palace, everyone was anxious. Emperor Richard, famous for being very wise and fair, was about to make a very important decision. This choice would not only change the future of the empire, but also the life of a young woman. It was a very old tradition, dating back to the time of the emperor's ancestors, to choose the chosen one. Ever since he was a child, Richard knew that when the time came for him to marry, he would have to choose a wife from among the many young women in the villages. Several girls were selected to be presented to the emperor, following tradition. From an early age, they were trained for the big day, learning various arts and skills to stand out among the chosen ones. One of them was Madeline, a young girl from the village who charmed everyone with her beauty and grace. But unlike the other girls, Madeline didn't want to become empress. While the other girls devoted all their efforts to the cultural activities taught by their teachers, Madeline didn't put as much effort into her studies. Her teachers always scolded her, saying, "If you're not perfect in this art, you won't be chosen by the emperor." She quickly replied, "Who says I want to be the chosen one?" For many years, Madeline lived in fear of that day, until the inevitable arrived. When those in charge began to choose the girls of the village, Madeline hid in her room to avoid being found. However, her neighbors denounced her, telling those in charge that there was a girl of incomparable beauty who was not among those chosen. Warned that one girl was missing, they went to Madeline's house and were surprised to see how beautiful she really was. They decided to choose her as the village representative. When she found out she had been chosen, Madeline was very sad. Ever since she was a little girl, she had liked a boy from the village and, even without him knowing it, she believed that one day he would realize her feelings. Madeline never exchanged a glance or a more daring word with the boy, but she always hoped that he would notice and like her one day. Not knowing what to do, she decided to act badly in front of the emperor so that he wouldn't choose her. She didn't know what the emperor was like, as the people in her class had never come into contact with him. She knew one thing for sure: he must be one of those terrible men, with a horrible appearance, spoiled and full of arrogance. The long-awaited moment finally arrived. Madeline was led to the emperor, who was waiting for her surrounded by all his grandeur. Madeline entered with her head down, avoiding looking at him, while he examined her attentively. For a few moments, a heavy silence overtook the place, until the emperor interrupted him, asking, "You're Madeline, daughter of the tanner Cephas, who works with leather, aren't you?" The emperor's voice filled the hall, sounding authoritative and calm. "Yes, my lord," replied Madeline, keeping her voice respectful and her head down. Emperor Richard watched her for a moment before continuing. "You have a beauty that attracts attention throughout the kingdom, your intelligence is highly praised and your kindness is recognized by all. But there is something else about you that catches my eye. Madeline, tell me, what do you expect from becoming the emperor's chosen one?" he asked. Keeping her head down, she took a deep breath to gather her courage and replied, "Your Majesty, my desire is not to dedicate myself entirely to the empire by marrying the Lord, following such an ancient tradition." The emperor, visibly surprised, asked, "Why do you think that, Madeline?" "Because I wanted to marry for love, to someone who also loves me, sire," she explained. The emperor then spoke, "I understand your point of view, Madeline, but an emperor must preserve, not break, the traditions of his people." After this conversation, the emperor thanked Madeline for her presence and released her to leave. Madeline returned home, certain that the emperor would not choose her, and feeling happy that she had expressed everything she thought about this tradition that she considered meaningless. While the other selected girls nervously awaited the result, Madeline was calm, confident that she would not be chosen by the emperor. The result was fixed to important posts in the villages where the girls had been selected. People flocked to the posters to find out who had been chosen. Madeline didn't even bother to leave her room, so calm was she about the result. Suddenly, she heard a great commotion at her door. The villagers were celebrating the choice of the future empress with great joy. They were shouting, dancing and jumping, filling the air with happiness. Madeline, completely confused, looked at everyone in amazement. Then her mother came up to her and revealed that she was the emperor's chosen one. Poor Madeline. Despite everything she had told the emperor, he had chosen her. How is this possible? as she thought, unable to believe what was happening. Madeline found herself in a situation she couldn't escape. She would be forced to marry against her will. The day she had been dreading finally arrived. Elegantly dressed, her parents accompanied her to the palace. As she entered the hall where the event was to take place, the emperor stood with his back to her, waiting for her. When he turned to face her for the first time, Madeline gave him an angry look. Although she was upset, Madeline soon realized that the image she had of a man with no physical qualities didn't match what she saw in front of her. The man who was there to marry her was incredibly handsome, muscular, and had a gentle manner. He held her hand and the ceremony began. The celebration was spectacular, with many nobles present to praise her beauty and hail her as the new empress. But the hardest moment for Madeline was yet to come. After the party, she was taken to the emperor's private room. A few ladies-in-waiting helped her prepare for what they called her a honeymoon. Madeline was determined that if it were up to her, the emperor would never have intimate contact with her, nor would she easily give in to the wishes of the man she was forced to marry. After dressing completely, the ladies-in-waiting left the room and the emperor entered. With a smile, he observed attentively how beautiful his wife really was. Trying to be charming, he approached to embrace her. At that moment, Madeline stepped back, clearly rejecting his affectionate gestures. He, clearly impatient, asked, "Do you refuse your own husband's caresses?" She looked him in the eye and replied, "I told you I didn't want to get married, but your Majesty ignored my words." The emperor, realizing that Madeline was refusing to be with him on their first night together, became very angry and exclaimed, "How dare you reject me? I am the emperor, your lord and husband." At that moment, he tried to force her into his arms, trying to kiss her. Madeline, with a look of disgust, replied, "Yes, I know that your Majesty is the emperor, my husband, and you have the power to force me to marry against my will. But even if you can control my body, you will never win my heart," she replied firmly. Richard, soon back on his feet after trying to grab her by force, said, "I could impose my authority now, my dear, but I choose not to. After all, there are many other women who would be honored to spend at least one night with me. I made a mistake in choosing you. After all, what's the point of being beautiful if you're not receptive?" he asked. "I'm not insensitive. Your Majesty forces me to marry against my will and still expects affection and love from me? Who is insensitive here, sire?" replied Madeline, defending herself. At that moment, he reflected on her words and realized that his wife was right. He said, "Madeline, I'm sorry, I overstepped in my words and in the way I treated you in our first contact. I'm not that kind of person. But as the highest leader of our people, I must respect our cultures and traditions. I also believe in love. However, from an early age, I learned that when the time came, I should choose a woman from our people to desire and love." As he spoke, Madeline watched him, intrigued by his words. To Madeline's surprise, she began to notice that the man who was now her husband was actually very handsome. His black hair added an enchanting charm, with desire for her at that moment. She began to discover the handsome man in front of her as he continued to speak. "Many women have been introduced to me, but none have captivated me like you." He was really worried, because he knew he had to do his duty, even if none of the candidates had particularly appealed to him. "But when you appeared with your decisive way of speaking, my heart soared, and I knew that you were the woman for me. I felt I could fall in love with you. By choosing to marry you, I haven't abandoned the idea of a love marriage. I know you can still love me, Madeline. I'm sure of it." When he had finished speaking, he opened a door in the room and said, "For your sake, I'll be patient. I'll wait until you want me as much as I want you. I'll wait in the next room." When Madeline was alone, her head was spinning with so many thoughts. She'd done it. He promised not to pressure her for affection, which was a great relief. But he's so handsome. Better sleep, I'm exhausted. The next day, the palace was all decorated with flowers, and the emperor was waiting for them to have their first breakfast together, holding a rose in his hands. "Did you sleep well, my dear?" he asked. "Yes, your Majesty," she replied. "To you, I'm just Richard," he said softly, as he pulled out a chair for her to sit down. Richard was determined to win Madeline's heart, and with each passing day, she discovered more fascinating things about him. Richard always had nice surprises and lots of attention for Madeline, and he loved being around her. Everyone in the palace said that they were a perfect couple and that they were very lucky to get along so well. But what people didn't know was that their marriage hadn't yet been consummated. There was only one day to go until their wedding anniversary, and Madeline knew Richard well enough to know that he would be planning a surprise to celebrate the date. Thinking about this, she reflected on everything that had happened and how much she now thought of him in a different light, because she had found in the man who had chosen her a totally different person from what she had imagined. She soon realized that she was falling in love with him too. Richard had turned out to be a man who was not only kind, but also incredibly charming in her eyes. He had managed to bloom the flower of love in Madeline's heart. That evening, as he always did before going to his room, Richard went to say goodnight to Madeline. She was anxious for him to be closer to her and said, "Oh Richard, I feel so lonely in this huge bed. Could you stay here with me tonight, please?" He smiled without believing what he was hearing, finally making her feel comfortable with him, and replied, "But of course you're never alone, my dear, because I'll always be by your side." After that, she now kissed him affectionately of her own accord and without any pressure. This time, the 1-month wedding present was for him. Madeline gave herself to Richard with great joy, and they spent a night filled with unforgettable affection. The next morning, a big surprise party was organized at the palace to celebrate their first month of marriage. Emperor Richard was overflowing with joy, for he had indeed won the heart of the one he had chosen to be his wife. Madeline, the Empress, was openly showing her love for him. The couple's happiness was so evident that everyone in the palace and the surrounding area commented on the true love that united them. As the days went by, their love story inspired the inhabitants of the kingdom, proving that even hearts destined for arranged unions could find true love. The happiness of the Emperor and Empress became an example of love and commitment, celebrated in festivals and songs throughout the empire. They became symbols of a love that transcended obligations, inspiring everyone to believe that, even in the most unlikely arrangements, true love can flourish. Did you like Richard and Madeline's story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more charming tales like this one.